Welcome to Plants of the Gods, the podcast where we explore the plants that have transformed human history, culture, and consciousness with ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin. In this special episode, we dive into the rich and often surprising history of the global spice trade, drawing inspiration from historian Roger Crowley's latest book, The Spice Trade: The Extraordinary History of the World's Most Coveted Commodity.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plants of the Gods. This is Mark Plotkin, Dr. Mark Plotkin with the Amazon Conservation Team. You can find us on the web at www.amazonteam.org. We look forward to seeing you there. Today, I want to talk about the spice trade, the most important period in global history in terms of tropical plants. And I want to add a brief review of a wonderful new book that's come out on this subject. If you want more information on the spice trade and read a written review of the book, be sure to check out our website, www.amazonteam.org/spice. Now, one of the most significant and vital eras in the history of ethnobotany coincided with the spice trade during the European Age of Discovery, which began in the 15th century with the Portuguese exploration of Africa and wound down in the late 17th century when cultivation of spices expanded throughout the tropical world. Nonetheless, the trade in spices by Arab, Chinese, and Indian merchants commenced long before European involvement. Botanical bounty, or I should say botanical booty, like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and black pepper were moving from Southeast Asia and India, where they were native, to the Middle East long before the early 1400s, when Prince Henry the Navigator kick-started Portuguese exploration of tropical regions. The spice trade changed the world in many fundamental ways, including in agriculture, cartography, navigation, religion, spycraft, and even major aspects of capitalism as we know it. As a 1998 article in The Economist magazine noted, quote, "If history's modern age has a beginning, the spice trade is it." To support this expansion into tropical regions, Europe's merchant classes would invent new forms of commercial credit, and the first great corporations vital parts of capitalism's operating system and spread their trading networks across the 7 seas. Charles Corn, in his excellent 1999 book, The Sense of Eden, A History of the Spice Trade, echoed these sentiments. Quote, "The spice trade was the lifeblood of civilization and brought with it a tide of wealth sweeping through a still largely barbaric Europe." Remember, that was the Dark Ages. Literally worth their weight in gold, the cloves, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, ginger, and black pepper spawned a new age of revolutionary economics based on credit, the rise of a rudimentary banking system, and ultimately free enterprise. End of quote. It's difficult to overemphasize the importance of spices and the spice trade in the ancient world. In the words of my late colleague Fred Rosengarten, who was not only a spice grower but a spice historian, in his classic 1969 book, The Book of Spices, quote, "As we look back across some 5,000 years of recorded history, we begin to grasp the pivotal part that spices have played in the development of modern civilization. In an epoch where Europe knew nothing of sugar, tea, chocolate, coffee," covered in earlier episodes of Plants of the Gods, "potatoes, citrus, or tobacco, to say nothing of plumbing or refrigeration, Oriental spices supplied flavor and piquancy to food and drink and fragrant aromas to mask a multitude of unpleasant odors. So useful, indeed indispensable, were spices, both politically and economically, that kings sent expeditions in search of them. Merchants risked life and fortune to trade in them. Wars were fought over them. Whole populations were enslaved. The globe was explored, and such far-reaching changes as the Renaissance were brought about by the restless, ruthless competition. End of quote. Spices played many roles in the ancient world. As today, they were culinary staples, enhancing flavors in bland and monotonous diets. Unlike today, they were often used to mask the flavor of foods that were past their prime, a necessity in an age without refrigeration. Spices were a mainstay of ancient medicine as well, for a comparable reason. They harbor essential oils and compounds that can inhibit the growth of bacteria and other microorganisms. The importance of the antimicrobial effects of spices, an essential benefit in a world without the antibiotics that are available now, is often downplayed or overlooked in the histories of the spice trade. In other words, the first spices were also the first antibiotics. And it's no accident that most of the spicy spices, like chili pepper or black pepper, were developed in tropical regions where food would spoil much more quickly. The fragrances of these spices were also valued for what we would now term aromatherapy. In an epoch where soaps and perfumes were either unavailable or the province of the very wealthy, sweet-smelling spices were in great demand. Both these properties, antimicrobial and aromatic, were undoubtedly reasons that spices served as key commodities in Egyptian mummification rituals. Ancient Jewish traditions also widely employed these plant products. Spices like cinnamon, for example, were used to make anointing oils and burned as incense in the Great Temple in Jerusalem. And the Bible is full of reference to spices. And for more information on spices and more detail and a written account of much of what I'm telling you today, check out our webpage, www.amazonteam.org/spice. For the Romans, spices ranked among the most highly prized commodities in the Eternal City. The historian and naturalist Pliny the Elder famously criticized the empire's obsession with spices, complaining that Rome wasted enormous sums on frivolous foreign luxuries. His remarks highlighted a larger concern about the drain of wealth to Asia in exchange for spices and other commodities. So much wealth flowed east that gold and silver Roman coins are still occasionally found in India, particularly in the south near the Malabar coast, where black pepper originated. Spices have loomed large in both history and religion for thousands of years. Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was a spice merchant by profession. In the book of Genesis, Joseph is sold to Arabian spice traders who were headed to Egypt, foreshadowing the Jews' eventual return to Israel, the so-called Exodus, from the land of the Pharaohs. And the three wise men who visited the infant Jesus in the manger were very likely Persian spice merchants. Much of the early trade in spices, at least until the mid-15th century, was by the overland route, commonly called the Silk Road. Arab merchants served as middlemen, connecting tropical Asian plant products with Middle Eastern and European markets. Venice served as the entrepot, that is the entry point, for these goods coming from the East. Venice's wealth, power, and cultural flowering can be attributed in large part to the substantial profits that the spice trade generated. But as demand increased while supplies did not, spice prices continued to rise, creating a strong economic incentive for Europeans to obtain direct access to the spice lands. One relatively obvious route was to sail east from Europe, thereby circumventing the land routes controlled by the Arabs. Certainly, there already existed maritime trade in spices and other commodities, but this was relatively limited in geographic scope, mostly in the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. None of these merchants had sailed across either the Atlantic or the Pacific. For Western Europeans, a large obstacle blocked access to the Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands, and that very large obstacle was the continent of Africa. For those crowns and explorers willing to entertain the speculation that the world was round, another route to the lands of spices presented itself, sailing west. The Spaniards led the way when Christopher Columbus headed west to the Americas in 1492. 6 years later, The Portuguese blazed their own oceanic trail in the opposite direction, with Vasco da Gama sailing south, rounding the African Cape of Good Hope, and continuing east to India. It's interesting to note, when da Gama first disembarked in India, he's said to have proclaimed, quote, "For Christ and spices." This must have come as something of a surprise to the local Christians, whose community had been founded by St. Thomas the Apostle in the year 52 of the Christian era, more than 300 years before Christianity had become fully rooted in da Gama's home country of Portugal. Da Gama's declaration, nonetheless, encapsulates the idealism, ignorance, religious fanaticism, and greed of the European spice seekers. The true significance of these two voyages became clearer in 1522 when Ferdinand Magellan's crew completed the first circumnavigation of the globe. This harsh and brutal 3-year journey resulted in the death of the commander, that is Magellan himself, and the demise of most of the ship's sailors. Only 18 of the original 270 who embarked with Magellan in 1519 returned to Spain in 1522, a survival rate of less than 7%. The rivalry between Spain and Portugal, as they raced across the oceans to take control of the global spice trade, especially that of cloves, mace, and nutmeg, forms the basis of Roger Crowley's wonderful new book, Spice, the 16th Century Contest that Shaped the Modern World. The book is a sort of narrative synecdoche. The book details a 2-century period to tell a broader story of a trade that actually spans 2,000 years. Spice is a rollicking good read. Crowley, a historian and author whose specialty is maritime history, is a gifted storyteller. His detailed account of Magellan's voyage is terrifying enough to make any sailor question whether to leave dry land ever again. He also brings to life not only well-known figures like da Gama and Magellan, but also the anti-colonial Philippine chief Lapu-Lapu and the extraordinary Juan Sebastian Elcano, who successfully took command of the expedition when Magellan was killed, only to perish himself when he tempted fate by attempting a second voyage around the globe merely 4 years after his return to Spain. What makes this book so intriguing is that it brims with extraordinary characters and stories of arrogance, betrayal, bravery, cannibalism, idealism, and evil. In Crowley's telling, the spice trade is a cautionary tale in which history, exploration, culture, and commerce clash. Indigenous peoples also suffer greatly in the wake of a pattern of colonialist extractivism that endures to the current day. Quoting The Economist magazine once more, quote, "In the war for spices, Portuguese and Spanish explorers killed locals and each other with gusto." End of quote. What transpired in Magellan's fleet is a microcosm of the intercultural confusion, violence, and treachery that threads through the book. Born in Portugal, Magellan sailed as a representative of the King of Spain. Some 3/4 of his sailors were Spanish, and another 15% were Portuguese. Neither nationality seemed to have trusted the other, and elements of both seemed to have distrusted Magellan. After a mutiny, several sailors were executed, while others were marooned on an island and left to die. Rivalries intensified after Magellan was killed in the Philippines in 1521, leading to more dissension and misery as his remaining shipmates sailed on. The indigenous peoples, meanwhile, were not helpless bystanders. Magellan was killed in battle after stupidly taking sides in a confrontation between local groups. After his death, some of the fleet's surviving leaders were invited to a feast supposedly given in their honor by a different local chief. There, many of the Europeans were massacred by their so-called hosts. More often, though, when European steel was pitted against local wooden spears and arrows, the outcome was devastating for the indigenous peoples. Time after time, as Crowley writes, quote, trade and conquest went hand in hand." End of quote. Crowley opens the book by detailing the early history of the spice trade, emphasizing the aforementioned Silk Road route from Southeast Asia to the Middle East and beyond. He then charts the Portuguese rise to power, of which Magellan's voyage is a dramatic highlight. Holland then enters the picture in the guise of a ruthless Dutch East India Company as the two European powers battled over nutmeg and mace from the Moluccas, the so-called Spice Islands, to the detriment of the indigenous peoples and forests of this Asian archipelago. Finally, the Spanish Empire appears on the scene in the form of the Manila galleon trading ships, which established regular maritime connections between Asia, primarily the Philippines, and the Americas, primarily Mexico, and then on to Europe, primarily Spain. Crowley concludes by charting the decline of the spice monopoly as the expanding European presence in Asia, along with competition and cultivation of spices in other tropical colonies, increased supply while reducing demand. Finally, as an ethnobotanist, I note that Crowley's book features lots of ethno, but very little botany. To be expected, the author is a maritime historian, so it comes as no surprise that this text focuses more on ship's captains, capstans, and crow's nests than on cloves, more mizzenmast than mace. Nonetheless, Crowley's writing is clear and engrossing, and the history is accurate and compelling. I recommend this book without reservation. However, readers who want a more global perspective with a heavier dose of botany would do well to seek out Fred Rosengarten's Book of Spices from 1999, or Gary Nabhan's Cumin, Camels, and Caravans, A Spice Odyssey, published by UC Press in 2014, which I regard as an overlooked gem. As a further complement to Crowley's book, which focuses so heavily on the Portuguese role in the spice trade, I also recommend Nathaniel's Nutmeg, The True and Incredible Adventures of the Spice Trader Who Changed the Course of History by Giles Milton, who further details the role of the Dutch, who not only replaced the Iberians in the Spice Islands, but also, unfortunately, proved even more brutal. And let me say in conclusion that you can find additional information on the books I mentioned, that these references, on our webpage, www.amazonteam.org/spice.
Thanks for listening to Plants of the Gods with ethnobotanist Dr. Mark Plotkin. To support efforts to protect spices and other plants, please consider donating at www.amazonteam.org. And don't forget to give this commercial-free podcast a 5-star rating.